If you struggle with getting clothes to fit you, I've got 10 tips that are going to help you sew better fitting garments. I've always found that when I sew clothes that fit me a lot better, I end up wearing them a lot more and they don't just kind of gather dust at the back of my wardrobe. It can be overwhelming when you don't know why the things that you're sewing aren't fitting you well, so hopefully these 10 tips will help you. The first thing you want to make sure you're doing is taking measurements correctly. This sounds so simple, but you'd be surprised how many people overlook such an important step of sewing. So as you might know, before you sew something, you always want to take some key measurements, and that's your bust, your waist, and your hip. I personally have this measuring tape right here. If I pull it open, it's a retractable one. I press this button and it snaps back in place, but you want to basically use a measuring tape that's flexible like this. I'm going to show you how to take your bust measurement just to show you how it should look like. So I've got my body right here, and you want to make sure you're wearing what undergarments you normally wear. So I personally don't normally wear a bra, so I'm not wearing one. So you want to open out your measuring tape and you want to wrap it around your body like this. And you want to go across your nipples, and that's going to be the fullest part of your chest. So for me, that looks like that. This is the front, and then on the back you can see that the actual measuring tape isn't twisted, and that's exactly what we want. We don't want it, for example, drooping all the way down there or just kind of twisted as we're doing it. It needs to be straight all along, and then where the two ends meet is what measurement you need to write down. When I'm taking my measurements, I like to write down the date that I actually took them, because I try to retake them every couple of months because I want to make sure I'm sewing clothes for the body that I am right now. It's such a simple step, and I know most people overlook taking measurements correctly, so just go ahead and try to make sure that the measurements you've got for you are correct. The next thing you want to do is make sure you're picking a size based on the measurement chart of the pattern you're using and the finished garment measurements. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I have a paper pattern right here, a McCall's one, and at the back of the pattern you can see right here, so it has the size chart right here, so it's got extra small all the way to extra large. But you don't only want to just look at this section, you also want to find the finished garment measurements, which as you can see goes from the same extra small to extra large. But if you compare the two, you'll see that they actually differ. Now, the reason why they differ is because the finished garment measurements will include any design ease. So this jacket right here, you can see it's quite a loose fitting vibe. It's not fitted at all. And the size chart is the size you're going to sew in relation to what body you are. But the finished garment measurements will actually show you the design ease of what this jacket is. So we know it's a looser fit. So the finished garment measurements at the waist, for example, is going to be much bigger than the size chart. I know it can sound kind of complicated, but the reason why you want to look at both is because you might find when you first look at the size chart, it's quite clear that maybe you're a size medium. But when you look at the finished garment measurements, you might see, oh, it's got a lot more ease. So there's a lot more room in the garment for me to move around. So I could even get away with a size small. Whenever I pick a pattern that I'm going to sew, I never just take into account the size chart. I also take into account the finished garment measurements, because I personally want to know how loose it's going to be on me once I've sewn it up. It's honestly just useful to look at both, because if you find garments aren't fitting you correctly, if they're too tight or they're too small, looking at the finished garment measurements would help you understand what size you should pick in relation if you want the garment to be tighter or looser, depending on what your preference is. My next tip is to make a toile or a muslin of the garment before you cut into your final fabric. I know how boring this is. Who wants to make another version of a project before you start on the actual one? I know it is quite a long process to do, but just trust me on this one. If you make a garment first in a cheaper fabric like a muslin or a calico, then you know how it's going to fit you roughly before you cut into your expensive fabric. I personally never used to do this when I first started sewing. I would just go straight in and see how it would fit, but the amount of times I ruined my fabric, and also I just made things that didn't fit me how I wanted to. That's why it's important to make a test version or a toile before you cut into your final fabric, so you can assess the fit, you can make any adjustments to the pattern, and then cut out your final fabric. So I actually have a whole bunch of calico right here. I got this from Minerva. I'll leave a link down below, but it's a really nice kind of, it's not too lightweight, but it is light to medium weight fabric. As you can see, it looks like this, and it's just a really simple fabric, so you can make it out in this, see how it fits you, and then make any adjustments you need on the pattern. So whether you've made a toile or you've made your final garment and you've realized it doesn't really fit you how you want wanted, the next step to do is to make sure you take time to adjust the sewing pattern to your personal body. I myself am a sewing pattern designer, and I know that patterns are always created to a standard size measurement, and they don't take into account individual proportions, so how they might fit each person with a different body type. It's nearly impossible to make a sewing pattern that fits every single person perfectly, which is why you do need to make adjustments to patterns to fit your personal body. It can be really overwhelming to understand what certain parts of the pattern you need to change to fit you correctly, but the basic ones you can try are, for example, grading. So let's say you're a size 8 at the bust, but at the waist you're maybe a size 10 on the pattern that you're making, and you don't want to just sew a straight size 8 because it won't fit you at the waist. You can grade in between sizes, which is when you basically just draw a line from one section of the pattern to another section of the pattern, and you basically just join two sizes together. It's probably the most easiest and most effective change you can do to a sewing pattern to help fit your body more correctly. You also might find lengthen and shorten lines on sewing patterns. So for example, if you've made a skirt and you want to make it longer, you can either lengthen at those lengthen and shorten lines, so add length or take away length, or you can just go to the bottom of the garment at the hem and add fabric to that instead of putting it in a specific section. Again, if you've made a top and you've realized the sleeves are too short on you, on your next version, for example, you could easily just add extra length to the hem of the sleeve. Another adjustment you can do to your pattern pieces is do a small or full bust adjustment. This one's definitely a bit more complex, but once you do it once or twice, it is easier to get your head around. And basically that's when you increase or decrease the bust area of your pattern, but you do it in such a way that it just creates more room for the bust area. I know trying to decipher what exact fitting issue you have can be really complex, but I've got these books that I really recommend, and I'll leave some links down below in the description box for you to check out. Another easy tip you can do to help you sew better fitting garments is actually to increase your seam allowance. So you want to do this in places like the bust, the waist and the hips. And the reason why this is really useful is because, for example, if you're not sewing a toile or a test version of your pattern, you've already included extra seam allowance at these spaces. So if you find it's too tight, you can actually account for this because you've added a larger seam allowance. So for example, you might want to add 1 inch of a seam allowance rather than having a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This just gives you a lot of wiggle room, so when you're doing fitting as you're sewing the garment, you have extra room for you to make adjustments. It's actually a really simple step to incorporate before you cut out your fabric. So I personally just like to do this on patterns that I've never made before because I know it'll give me a bit more wiggle room in places that I need it. Another really easy, simple thing you can do to make sure the garments are going to fit you at the end is actually to try the clothes on before it's finished. So for example, let's just say you've sewn the side seams of a top. It's really useful to try it on now before you end up sewing any other part of the garment to make sure it fits you correctly before you sew in things like the sleeves. You can even do things like baste these areas, which means basically using a longer stitch length on your sewing machine, so you're not sewing the final stitching and it's really easy to seam rip it out if something's wrong with the fit. Again, I personally never did this when I first started sewing, and I wish I just realized how important it is and how easy it is to do as well when you're sewing. Even little things like before you hem your garment, just try the dress or the top on to make sure it fits you and hits you exactly where you want it, because the amount of times I've just gone really quickly and rushed the project just because I want it to be finished, and then I've tried it on and simple things like the hem is too long and I could have just tried it on, cut the excess fabric off and then hemmed it. These things are honestly so simple to fix if you just take the time to try it on first before you sew details like the hem. The next tip I have if you want to sew better fitting garments is honestly just to pick the right fabric for your pattern. Now it sounds really simple, like how can you pick the wrong fabric, but you'll be surprised that some fabrics just don't work with the style of garment that you're trying to create. So for example, let's say I'm trying to sew a really flowy loose dress. If I pick a fabric that's really stiff, it's just not going to work how I intend it to. Fabrics behave differently, they don't all feel and move the same. So for example, if you want lighter, kind of more fluid fabrics, things like viscose, silk, lighter weight cottons or linens and things like that will work for that style. If you want more boxier clothing that's a bit more structured, then things like a medium weight cotton or a linen would be better suited for that. I personally just like to order lots of different samples of fabrics on websites, or just go in person and touch and feel them so you can see how they behave. It's definitely a skill that will develop over time as you're sewing, understanding what fabrics work with which patterns. But don't let that deter you. Honestly, it's something that will come to you naturally. You just need a lot of practice to understand what works with what. One thing you definitely want to make sure you do before you cut out your fabric is to pre-wash your fabric. And that's basically when you wash your fabric in your washing machine or whatever washing method you're going to use for the final garment, because if you don't do this, it can actually shrink in the wash and then it won't fit you anymore. If you found you followed all those steps but you still find the garment doesn't really fit you well, the next thing you want to make sure you do is mark all your notches. So let's say you've been sewing the garment, and as you've been sewing it, you've realized that maybe some things don't line up as they look like they should. It might be because you've not marked your notches and used them to make sure each pattern piece aligns as they should. Notches can look like small dashed lines, or they can look like triangles at the edge of pattern pieces, and you basically want to use these and help you align pattern pieces together to make sure they're sitting correctly before you sew them. It's really important that you follow these because you want to make sure you're sewing the pattern as it's been intended to, and also it helps you make it fit better when you're assembling it. It's completely up to you how you mark your notches onto fabric. You can use chalk, you can use a pen, you could even use scissors. Just make sure you're not snipping into the seam allowance when you snip them. It's such a simple step that I feel like a lot of people do overlook by accident. If you do find as you're sewing something that you can see a notch on the pattern piece but you forgot to do it on your actual fabric, literally just put that pattern piece over the fabric and remark your notch. The next thing I recommend to do to make sure you're sewing clothes that fit you better is to invest in some good quality tools when you're sewing. So for example, I have this pair of scissors that I've had for ages now. I want to say like 2 or 3 years, and these cut so well. Just a simple step of cutting out your fabric is so important. If you cut out things incorrectly or they're kind of jagged and they don't really cut properly, that can actually affect the fit of your garment. Even things that are measuring, so like a seam gauge or a measuring tape, investing in a good pair of these will make sure you're taking correct measurements when you're actually taking measurements or sewing different seam allowances. If you only have a sewing machine, you find you really like sewing stretchy fabric, I definitely recommend getting an overlocker because that's a really great machine to have specifically for knit fabric. Honestly, simple things like making sure you're cutting and sewing precisely makes such a difference to having a professional and better fitting garment. The last tip I have to make sure you sew clothes that fit you better is to actually assess what's already in your personal wardrobe. You want to assess your wardrobe and see what things your garments have in common that you wear on a regular basis. So for example, you might find that actually you only wear trousers that have an elasticated waistband, and if you start sewing clothes that have fitted trousers with really tricky fastenings at the front of your trousers, so when you put on a pair of trousers that are very fitted and have a different type of fastening, you might find they don't fit you as intended because you're just not used to how that feels on your body. Even things like looking at what fabrics you normally use. So if you find in your wardrobe you always wear things that are stretchy out of like jersey fabric or knit fabric, and then you keep making blouses that are made out of cotton but you don't like how they fit you, it might be because you're normally used to wearing clothes that actually stretch with your body, and then when you're sewing clothes that don't have any stretch to them and the fabric is a bit more rigid, it might fit you differently because you're just not used to that style of garment. Whatever you find in your personal wardrobe is such a great representation of the things maybe you should sew because you personally already like wearing that style. So for me personally, I know that I really like wearing really comfortable trousers now that don't actually have any zips or anything like that. I like an elasticated waistband, so that's why I created patterns like the Freya trousers and the Henna trousers, because I prefer how they fit me because they adjust with my body, and I just like the fact that they're not too form-fitting. I feel like this step is always really overlooked, and actually when you take the time to do this, you can understand what you like to wear and hopefully recreate clothes that fit that style. I hope those tips help you understand different ways you can make sure you're sewing clothes that fit you better. Honestly, I feel like the best thing you want to do is just practice and experiment and try making all different types of clothing to understand what you personally like to wear. If you take the time to follow these steps, honestly, you'll sew clothes that will not only fit you better, but also you'll just enjoy wearing them naturally. I know how easy it is to just overlook a lot of these and just get really excited with the process and just start sewing straight away, but the worst thing is when you sew something and it doesn't even fit you how you intended. It's definitely a skill that takes a lot of practice and patience, and also just experimentation to see what you personally like to sew and also wear with your body shape. Definitely let me know down in the comments if you're going to use any of these in your sewing processes. Honestly, they make such a difference to make sure you're sewing clothes that will fit you better better, and I promise some of them are much easier to incorporate than you think. Make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video if you found it useful. I'll see you in the next one.